So this is Hyperbolas day 2, and this time instead of working with taking an equation and graphing it or taking a graph and writing an equation, we're going to be taking in the first part, taking some equations and getting some information from them. In the second part, we're going to be trying to create equations given certain characteristics. I'm going to break this up into a couple different videos. For this video, I'm just going to talk about page 1, and then I'll do probably 1 or 2 videos for page 2, depending on how long they get. So these notes start with kind of going through a lot of the information that we had in our first day of notes. So it's the definition, the set of all points, the difference of whose distance from two fixed points. Those two fixed points are called the foci. It's constant. A is always the number of units from the center to one of the endpoints of the transverse axis. A is always with the first or the positive fraction of your equation. B is the number of units from the center to the endpoint of the conjugate axis. Remember, the conjugate axis is the one that's perpendicular to transverse. Those two axes together create that rectangular box that gives us our asymptotes that the two branches of the hyperbola approach. C is the number of units from the center to the focus. The way you're going to know your C value or how those are all related is C squared is equal to A squared plus B squared. The transverse axis is the one that comes first. I always like to add a little bit of extra to that. I tend to remember it as the positive fraction. And part of the reason why is I have seen, not often, but I have seen some cases where the negative fraction comes first in a hyperbola, and so I just want you to be careful that it's the positive one that's associated with the transverse axis. The conjugate axis is the one that comes second, and again, I am going to mark that as the negative fraction. All right. So standard form, which is the one we've been working with, is, you've got your HK, you've got your A squared, your B squared, it's subtraction, it's always equal to 1. Same thing when your transverse axis is on the y-axis. That's going to be HK again, A squared, B squared, subtraction equal to 1. The first couple of problems here, and all the problems on this page, we are going to have to convert to standard form. And so when we look at this, right, we have this problem for problem number 1. It says find the center, the vertices, and the foci of the hyperbola 9x squared minus 16y squared is equal to 144. It does say to sketch the graph. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the problem is this is not a terribly useful form for the hyperbola. And one of the things that we want to think about is with the hyperbola form that we like, I'm going to say the standard form is the one I like at least, it's always equal to 1. All right, and that's not going to change for this format. So using that information, I can actually transform this given equation by basically dividing every single piece by 144. Now, off the top of my head, I don't quite recall what 140 or 9 over 144 is. So let me go ahead and convert that into a pretty little fraction, and that's 1 over 16. So this is going to become x squared over 16 minus, so 16 over 144, let's reduce that. And that turns into 1/9. All right, so that's going to be y squared over 9 is equal to 1. Now, this at least gets me the standard form that I prefer, and I know now a little bit more information. So first thing I know is that my center is the point 0, 0. All right, so that's the first thing I know. The second thing I know is I'm actually going to graph this thing because this way it'll help me figure out those vertices in the foci. All right, so quick sketch here. I know my center is at 0, 0. Along the transverse axis, this one's going to be the horizontal because the x comes first. I'm going to count 4 units to the left and 4 units to the right. I'm just going to mark that as 4 and negative 4. And actually, those are my vertices. Because the x comes first, I know that this thing is going to branch left and right like this. And so I can go ahead and mark those as the two vertices. So let's see, the vertices are going to be, what is that, 4, 0, and negative 4, 0. All right. And our last thing here is we're supposed to find the foci. Now, mathematically, I know that my foci sit somewhere within the curve, but I actually want to know what number it is. Like, what's the actual value for my foci? So I am going to say that c squared is equal to a squared plus b squared. So that means c squared is equal to 16 plus 9. Last time I checked, I'm pretty sure that's 25. I'm doing a quick double check to make sure my brain's still working today. It is. So c squared is equal to 25, which means c is equal to 5. So that means from the center to this focus point is 5 units on the x-axis. So my foci would be 5, 0, and negative 5, 0. And that's everything for problem number 1. All right, so we're given something that's not in the right format, or it's not in the standard form that we like, and so we're just basically converting it to standard form and working with it from there. So that's the same thing I'm going to do in number 2. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right on down to number 2 and start that one up. I'm going to go ahead and divide by 225 because I want to make sure that I can set this equation equal to 0. So 25 over 225 is 1 over 9. So this is going to be y squared over 9 minus, I'm going to guess it's going to be x squared over 25. Hey, I made a good guess. All right, 25 is equal to 1. All right, so a couple things. I know the center is going to be 0, 0. I know that let me actually mark the center here. Because y comes first here, I'm going to count the transverse axis as vertical. So from the center, I'm going to count up 3 units. All right, so there's positive 3. I'm going to count down 3 units. There's negative 3. And those are going to be my 2 vertices. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those, label them. So vertices, what is that? 0, 3, and 0, negative 3. All right. And in this case, my graph is going to open up and down along the y-axis. Okay, so that's the sketch of the graph. The last piece is, of course, the foci. So let's see. C squared is equal to a squared plus b squared. So c squared is equal to 9 plus 25. So I'm feeling like that's, 34, which means c is equal to the square root of 34. Now, 34 does not simplify nicely with a perfect square, but if I take its square root, that's approximately 5.83-ish. All right. So on the graph, if I marked that, it would be, point here, point here. It's within the curve. And so my 2 foci, my x-axis, or my x value has not changed, still 0. And I'm going to have root 34, it would be positive, and 0, negative root 34 to catch the negative foci down here. All right, so that's problem number 2. I'm going to slide on down to number 3, and this is going to be the end of the video then after I finish number 3. All right, so what do we have here? Same kind of problem. We're going to start with our equation. We're going to convert it to standard form here by dividing everything, in this case, by 64. So x squared over 64 minus y squared. I'm pretty sure that's over 16. Let me do a quick double check. And it is. All right, so there's 16 is equal to 1. So things I immediately know, the center is going to be 0, 0, except apparently I need to put the parentheses in the right place. There we go. Okay, so sketch is going to be, here's my center. Along my transverse axis, that's 8 units horizontally here because x comes first. So I'm going to come out here to positive 8, come out here to negative 8. So there are my 2 vertices. Okay, so vertices, that's going to be 8, 0, and negative 8, 0. And I know that my graph is opening left and right. Okay, so there's my hyperbola. That's the sketch. And the last thing I need to do is to find the two foci. So c squared is equal to, in this case, 64 plus 16, right? That's our a squared and b squared. So I'm feeling like that's 80. It is. All right, so c squared is equal to, oops, hold on. I wanted to actually take that back to c is equal to the square root of 80. That's what I was trying to get at. 80 has a perfect square of 16 living inside of it, so this is really 4 root 5, which decimal-wise, it's going to be 8 point something rather large, 8.94. There we go, 8.94. Now, it's not particularly helpful with this problem to get this particular number, other than to know that because from the center to the vertex is our A value, and our C value needs to be larger than that. But because we're not working with a grid, it's not super, super important that we get that decimal value to make sure that we're graphing it on the exact right grid space. This is a sketch. What I am going to be looking for, though, is where are my two foci? And so that's going to be 4 root 5, 0, and negative 4 root 5, 0. Because our x values are the ones that changed from the center. All right, so that's the first part of this video in terms of getting this first page done. I'm going to go ahead and close it here. If you have any questions or concerns,